Okay, so I'll start introducing our speaker for the day. Yeah, just make sure you have your videos off, please, just so it helps with the internet connection. Okay, so we have Dr. Carolina here today. I have my wrong page open. There you go. She is a lecturer in psychology at the University of Glasgow. She is the founder of TIO, which is the Teaching, Innovation, and Learning Enhancement Network, which is how I met her, actually, right? So I went all the way to Scotland, which was a very beautiful train trip, by the way. Highly recommended if you haven't done that yet, to give a talk about Seneca learning, about memory to her network, which is a very, very good idea. She can explain a bit more about it also during the talk. And she is also one of the members of the Learning Scientists, which if you don't know them, I also highly recommend. They have incredible resources free for students and for teachers about all sort of evidence-informed techniques and strategies, classroom strategies, learning strategies, teaching strategies. It's really, really good. So I'm very excited to have Carolina here to talk about a very important topic, always, and also now, these times that we're living in. Okay, so again, make sure you ask your questions in the chat during the talk, because I can ask them to Carolina in the end. Okay, so let's start.
All right, thank you very much for the kind invitation and the introduction. I'm very happy to be here today and to give this talk. It's a topic that has caught my interest from a research perspective side only very recently. But it's one that for a long time, being a lecturer at universities is something that you encounter quite often, students with test anxiety or anxiety to speak in front of an audience. So it can take different forms, different levels. And I thought, well, what's the research behind it? What do we know about test anxiety in education? And just really to learn more about it. So today's talk, let me see here. Going to the next slide if that works. Yeah. So today's talk is going to be structured around 5 questions. The first question being, okay, what is test anxiety? How do we define test anxiety? Then why should we care about test anxiety? How do we measure test anxiety? Where does it come from? What are factors that contribute to test anxiety? And last but not least, what can be done about it? What are interventions that have been shown to be effective to reduce test anxiety? So let's start in the beginning with anxiety in general. And when we think about anxiety, what it is pretty much an interaction between a reaction, a personal individual reaction towards a threat in the environment. Okay, there's some kind of danger in the environment, and our body and cognition will react in a way to prepare us for that threat. So in itself, anxiety is a very basic human emotion, and it's very adaptive to show anxiety when we encounter a threat. It comes with different components. You have a cognitive component. For example, you will worry about the situation. You have an affective component, which means, for example, that you experience tension in your body. You have arousal, somatic arousal, also a bodily state. And you have behavioral, and you also have behavioral reactions. So, for example, when you encounter a threat and a dangerous can people hear?
Yeah, don't worry about the chat.
Yeah, all right, okay.
Because otherwise you just get too confused during a talk and really need to check again.
I'll fine.
Yeah,
We have
don't worry about that.
we have a behavioral component, for example, avoidance of the threatening situations. We can further make a very important distinction when we talk about anxiety. On the one hand, you can show anxiety as kind of a state anxiety, which is just a temporary feeling of anxiety that is triggered by very specific events. So it could be, you might be anxious if you're sitting an exam, or if you have to sit an exam, but not if you have to give a presentation, for example. And on the other hand, you can have anxiety as a trait. This is a more stable individual difference. So some people are more prone to experience anxiety than other people, and to demonstrate and show and react with anxiety towards a variety of different situations. Now, when we talk about test anxiety, what we have is that we have an anxiety that is triggered by a very specific situation, namely a test, or it could be that you have to present something in class, or it could be that pretty much any evaluative situation in the classroom, right? And every time that situation comes up, the person reacts with anxiety. Okay, so it is that interaction between a state and a trait, anxiety, reacting towards exams, tests, quizzes, presentations with anxiety. That's what test anxiety is. I always like to look at some definitions, how other researchers have defined test anxiety. Here's one. I'll just give you a couple of minutes, a couple of seconds to read this one. And I also like this one here. So what we have here and what we see very immediately is in both definitions of test anxiety is that we are looking at an interaction really between personal factors, namely the response with anxiety, and a situational factor, which is, for example, in any kind of evaluative situation. So what it is really is then that when we talk about test anxiety and we simply say, well, it's just, someone is afraid because there is a test, or some react with anxiety because there's a test, but there's much more to this. It has like this multi-dimensional component to it, and this is what I will be talking about today. Different researchers have basically looked at different components that make test anxiety, that test anxiety is basically made of. And while there are many different researchers that have suggested different components, they all seem to agree upon two components for test anxiety. On the one hand, there seems to be an affective physiological component, and on the other hand, there seems to be a cognitive component. The affective physiological component is also labeled emotionality, and it comes with everything, you can say everything that you can experience in your body when you're anxious about those evaluative educational situations. So it is the arousal that you have, a tension that you have, some kind of stomach discomfort, sweaty hands, for example, an increased heart rate. So all those different aspects that come with test anxiety, they fall under the umbrella of emotionality. And on the other hand, we have a cognitive component that is often labeled as worry. And worry can be shown as, reflective, negative thoughts about yourself, thoughts about failing, thoughts about what the consequences are if you fail, and this perception that you have during a test, when you're taking a test, for example, and at the same time you worry about that test, this kind of interference that comes into play. So all those different aspects, everything that basically takes place in our minds, in our thoughts, this has been summarized under the umbrella of cognitive and worry component of test anxiety. And while those two components, emotionality and worry, are distinct components, they are related to each other, but at the same time, you can really have very distinct ways on how they will manifest in situations. So just some statistics here to start with. The prevalence for test anxiety, and this is just a very general statistics here, is 25 to 30% in the population. And this really sounds like a lot, but this is basically on all different levels of test anxiety. Someone who is very low on test anxiety has experiences sometimes mild test anxiety and high. When we look at the highest test anxiety, so highest level of test anxiety, high worry, high emotionality in test and evaluative situations, the number is smaller, between 12 and 18%. There are some gender and ethnic differences when it comes to test anxiety. So we have higher prevalence for females and ethnic minorities that who report test anxiety in educational settings. It must not be the case that this translates to lower performance. So, for example, for gender differences, even though we have females, we have more females that report test anxiety and experiencing test anxiety. This does not lead to a performance difference between men and women. And one idea here could be that maybe men do not just don't report test anxiety, having test anxiety that often. It could be again due to stereotype and some social stigma. And then we have cultural differences. In general, you find higher prevalence of test anxiety in societies where there's a strong focus on performance and performing well, and in cultures where you have very competitive mindsets. So, for example, one example that I found is Kuwait, where the mindset is a more collectivist one, more, okay, we work together to achieve goals. And in this context, test anxiety is less often reported, for example. So, this was basically what is test anxiety, and then let's talk a little bit about why should we care about it. Okay, what are the effects of test anxiety? And you can look at the effects of test anxiety on cognitive performance, on exam performance, on academic performance on the one hand. And this is basically the research that test anxiety research has basically focused on. And here what we have is that why should test anxiety affect cognitive performance? Well, because if you have test anxiety and you experience test anxiety in a test situation, or even before, so in anticipation of the test, this could decrease information processing. It could hinder encoding of information, that you actually store that information in the first place when you're learning something. And then later on, it can interfere with retrieving of the correct information during the test. And in fact, in another mechanism that has been revealed is that if you have a lot of worry and you experience that kind of emotional arousal and worry about a test, about yourself, about performing well, then this also interferes with paying attention to the correct information during the test, during test taking. And again, this decrease in attentional focus leads to a decrease in performance. One mechanism that has also been shown in different research papers is that test anxiety and the experience of test anxiety interferes with working memory processes. And working memory is something that we need when we are tackling a task, we're trying to retrieve information or solve a problem. For example, during an exam, we try to come up with the answer. And it requires that, first of all, we read, we take in that information, we keep that information in working memory, we retrieve information from long-term memory in order to apply it and to answer the question. And this all works within our working memory, and it has been shown that test anxiety affects our working memory capacity and leading to those processes to be harmed, and this can again lead to a decrease in cognitive performance. I already said most research has been done on the side of test anxiety and its effect on cognitive performance in the classroom and in education more generally. But another variable we would be interested in, of course, is well-being and mental health. And even though the links between test anxiety and well-being are not actually that far away from each other, that is actually one research area that has not been explored as much in the past, and something that is currently being tackled more specifically. Because again, experiencing test anxiety in itself is something that leads to can lead to lower well-being. This continuous tension that you experience if you're always worrying about your own performance, this will decrease your well-being and mental health. And it is related and can be an indicator for subjective well-being. For very high test anxiety levels, it can even be a risk for clinical forms of anxiety that needs to be treated more professionally. So let's start with the first one, with well-being and mental health real quick. What are the findings here? First of all, research shows that there is a negative relationship between test anxiety and subjective well-being, meaning that the higher test anxiety, the lower your subjective well-being. Interesting enough, when we look at the different components of test anxiety, worry versus emotionality, it seems to be the case that worry is the one that predicts lower life satisfaction and mood better than emotionality. And it is indeed the case that for very high test anxiety, it can reliably predict clinical anxieties, for example, social anxiety or specific phobias. In many cases, so almost 100% or 96% of the cases is a study that showed that. Another one here that looked at different coroner's reports, they found that looking at a study of adolescent suicide over the months of over 16 months, they found that in the reports that pressures from exams were named in 15% of the cases, and pressures from education in 27% of the cases. So what about cognitive performance? What did we find here? Again, already said that this is the area with the most research behind them. So we have, first of all, again, negative relationship between test anxiety and academic achievement. So very high anxiety leads to lower academic achievement. Again, the strongest relationship between test anxiety and academic achievement is found for the worry component rather than the emotionality component. There's even a relationship between test anxiety and performance on creative tasks. So not only on memory tasks that require a lot of memory retrieval, for example, or problem solving, but also in creative tasks. Well, creative tasks also very often does involve problem solving, for example. So here we also find this negative relationship between test anxiety and performance. There is a finding that the effects of test anxiety on performance is higher for lower achieving students, for lower ability students. Again, it could be a case, we have seen that working memory is one way on how test anxiety can affect performance. So it could be here that those students maybe have lower working memory capacity, and if in addition to that you have the burden of experiencing test anxiety, this could lead to a further decrease of performance. The material that you're studying, the test that you're taking also affects the link between test anxiety and performance. So for more difficult tasks, you find that there is a stronger link between those two than for easier tasks. And then overall, there's a statistic that shows that about 4% of performance in different evaluative settings in education and later on in the workplace can be explained by test anxiety. I like this quote by Dave Putwain. Dave Putwain, a researcher at in England, in Liverpool, and he is the guru basically when it comes to test anxiety. He wrote this piece for The Psychologist a couple of years ago. Just take your time to read this quote here from that article. So what it means is basically that those negative relationship between test anxiety and cognitive performance, if you look at the different research that has been conducted so far, the effects are usually small to modest. So maybe, again, it just affects one grade here and there. But again, what he says is if you are on a boundary for passing or not, this difference is very important for you. And so it always depends. Again, we have to see it put it into context and make sure to address test anxiety when we see students struggling with it. Further findings here has been shown that there are specific moderators that moderate the relationship between test anxiety and performance. And those moderators that I will show you next, these are ones that increase the negative relationship between test anxiety and performance. So in any kind of evaluative setting, so it must not be not only tests, but it can be a presentation that a student has to give, or just to speak up in class can be another thing happening all the time in the classroom. Contributing in a specific way can be experienced as a threat, and if that is perceived by a student with high test anxiety, then there's something to pay attention to. Any kind of speeded timed conditions, so timed tests or timed or short periods of time where they have to produce something that is restricted in time, this also leads to a more negative relationship between test anxiety and performance. The fear or the experience of negative feedback, and we already talked about this one. For more difficult tasks, you find a stronger negative relationship between test anxiety and performance. There are, however, luckily, factors that decrease the negative or even eliminate the negative relationship between test anxiety and performance. First of all, to give a lot of structure to students so that they can know what to expect in the next step, or what to expect in the exam, or let them experience exactly what the exam will entail. These are things that can help them to, in a way that test anxiety does not have that of a negative effect on performance. Any kind of social support that can be given by by other students, by other peers, but also by the teachers themselves. And provision of reassurance, again, something that can help to decrease the negative relationship between test anxiety and performance. Overall, it has been shown that we have already, I'm trying to get to the point where you can see that test anxiety can affect not only a specific performance in a test. So it's not that test anxiety will affect the student during the test, but rather someone with high test anxiety will be affected by that anxiety throughout the entire learning test cycle. So what does it mean? It affects them when they prepare for the test, when they sit the test, and when they reflect later on about the test. So for example, with test preparation, students with a lot of high test anxiety will probably use more procrastination or more ineffective study strategies, because maybe they wait until the very end before they actually engage in studying, and then they cram the night before, they don't get a lot of sleep, and so on. And so why does this happen? Because test anxiety can lead to behavioral changes such as avoidance. So not even looking at them, trying not to look at it, and trying to push it away, and not monitoring, for example, the learning and the time that should be spent on the material. And this basically is this vicious cycle then that leads to them not being as prepared, as well prepared as someone who does not experience test anxiety. So this anticipatory effect of test anxiety is something that has to be paid attention to. Then the effect of test anxiety during test taking. So intrusive thoughts. So when you're basically trying to, you look at the questions, you have these worries and these intrusive thoughts coming in about whether you're good enough or that you haven't studied well enough, and so on. And these thoughts interfere with the actual thought that you should be having during the exam, namely thinking about the target information, thinking about the test questions and your answers. Also a higher distractibility, meaning that not being able to focus on the actual test, but thinking about other things or looking at other, like looking at the environment, but not really at the test, being distracted by noises and so on. Pure cue utilization means that maybe they look at the questions, right? And maybe it triggers some kind of association for an answer, but it's not the right one. So these kind of things can happen as well if you have lots of test anxiety. And biased judgment of test difficulty is one where you get the test, you open it, you get the first question, and you're already thinking, oh my God, this is such a difficult question. I will not be able to do the entire test. And at this moment, the entire test is already doomed. Okay, so a biased judgment of test difficulty, not really biased in a way that it doesn't help you to actually continue and look at the question in the way that helps you to answer them. And then after the test, really, if you experience that negative test performance, that negative test taking, if you perceive it in such a negative way, and then later on maybe then you do not perform as well as you would have hoped. One thing that could happen is that students with high test anxiety, they will attribute failures to internal factors, saying something like, I'm just not good enough, that's why I didn't perform well, I cannot do this, I'm not capable of doing this. And if for some reason, for basically they actually performed well, they might think, oh, it's because I was just lucky on that day, right? Or the test was just easy. So this kind of attribution style is something that is very detrimental to your own self. And if this happens over a long course of time, it works basically, it hinders you to actually adopt better strategies again for test preparation, for test performance, and so on. So again, this is where the cycle actually closes. So how should we measure, how can we measure test anxiety? The number one way to measure test anxiety is through questionnaires. And the most prominent one that is used and that's out there is a Spielberger's test anxiety inventory. And what I would like you to do just for a couple of minutes, maybe 1 or 2, is based on what you learned so far about test anxiety, generate 2 questions that you would ask in a test anxiety questionnaire.
Can write there on the chat, actually.
Yeah, just write in the chat, exactly.
Just write in the chat.
You crammed the night before. You worry about failing, how you're revising, or did you sleep? Worried, support. Are you scared of failure? A lot about revision. You enjoy the test? Yes. What happens if you fail? Yeah. All right. So there are many good things there already. And what I already can see from the questions that you're generating, you're trying to generate questions that fall into one of the 2 components of test anxiety. So component worry versus component emotionality. And this is exactly what researchers do when they think about constructing a test, for example, to measure test anxiety. So in this one here, you have, again, in this inventory, and I'm just going to show you some examples of that, an affective component and a cognitive component. And for the affective component, they have to answer questions such as, while taking the test, I had an uneasy, upset feeling, or I felt very panicky when I took the test, or I felt my heart beating very fast during the test. And for the cognitive component, what we have is I froze up on the test. During the test, I found myself thinking about the consequences of failing. I think some of you already also generated questions like that. Or during the test, I got so nervous that I forgot facts I really knew. Okay, so again, this is just for each of those components. And there are actually so many other questionnaires out there that try to assess test anxiety. Again, this is just one that is predominantly used in research. So I already saw the question in the chat here. Where does it come from? Where does
the audio up?
Where does that?
Sorry, somebody has their mic on. I was trying to look for who this person is. Can you just make sure you have your mic off, please, everybody? Okay, carry on. Sorry.
All right, no, that's fine. So where does it come from? What are determinants or factors of test anxiety? And here again, we can look at 2 different factors: personal factors, biological predisposition, and primary family socialization. And the second one is situational factors. And what I'm going to do today, just because of time, I'm going to focus on the situational factors. So we're not going to talk about the personal factors. Mainly because the situational factors is something that teachers can have control over and can affect directly and change directly. So the first thing I want to talk about in situational factors are social reference group. So it really depends on how your classroom is constructed. if you have a mixed ability classroom or a classroom that is very homogeneous. And it has been shown that depending on the scenario in your classroom, you will experience higher or lower report of test anxiety. So in this study here by Zeidler, what they found is that in a very homogeneous context, and they did this one with gifted children, what they found was in homogeneous classes, they had higher reports of test anxiety, of anxiety in general. This was anxiety actually, and test anxiety. They had higher reports of test anxiety in homogeneous classes compared to mixed ability classes. Homogeneous classes means that there's more competition, you see more competition, everyone is basically on the same level, and you have to maybe do a little bit more to actually stick out of the masses. And this leads to more pressure and has been shown to lead to more worry and more emotionality perception. And at the same time as well, they also looked at self-concept, and in homogeneous classrooms, they reported lower self-concept than in mixed ability classes. Another label for that from social psychology is the big fish, little pond effect. Again, if you're one of the ones that is the superstar in the classroom, you probably will not experience as much test anxiety as if you are one of many and have basically this pressure to show your performance. Other two aspects of situational factors in classrooms is on the one hand group reference norms. So adopting group reference norms has a negative effect on motivation, on self-perception of students, and leads to more test anxiety. What does that mean? Group reference norms, this is what happened when I went to school. When I went to school, we had, for example, a test, and on the day the teacher returned our test, what they would do is the first thing that they would do, they would put on the blackboard the distribution of grades of all the students. It would say 2 students had an A, 5 students had a B, and then 8 students, whatever, have a C, and then we have one fail something. And this is the first thing that the teacher would do. And what happens there, immediately group reference norms are triggered. Where are you on this distribution compared to everyone else in your group, right? And this is something that is very demotivating for students, that leads to a lot of pressure for students if you are high performing, leads to a lot of fear and anxiety for students who are low performing. And so a better way is to use individual reference norms. And I think the majority of classrooms do this nowadays anyway. It's basically that an individual's performance is always compared to their own performance in the past. So compared to the past assessment that you did, how much better were you this time? Did you stay the same? What did you do better? What do you need to work on? Okay, and these kind of things give realistic goals for them to work on, and allows them to actually show that they can perform better than, based on feedback, for example, than what they did before. Competitive environment, we already talked a little bit about that. So whenever you have high competition in the classroom, high competition in the environment, a focus of one person outperforming others and so on, this highlights failures, this highlights these kind of aspects that trigger a lot of test anxiety. So again, the thing is, a bit of competition is nice to have. However, it's always difficult to balance that so that students who have experience or who do experience test anxiety do not suffer. A better way to do this again is to take away the competition between students and to focus really on understanding the material, that each student really understands the material. And the last aspect on situational factors that teachers can actually control is to give control to the student, to have them have control over their learning journey, over their way on how they perform, how they do the assessment, how they do the test, and so on. So here, what they did, they looked at anxiety and mathematics, and they had two conditions in this experiment. In one condition, they were allowed to choose between different tasks to perform and perform those tasks. And in the other one, they were given a set of tasks and everyone had to perform the exact same tasks. So they couldn't choose between a part of different tasks. And what they found is that in the condition where you're given a choice, where you have this control over your own learning and control over your own performance, and are allowed to make that decision, students experience less anxiety, and they also perform better in the actual test and activities. And this is something, at least in higher education, here in the UK, that it's done a lot. I don't know of any exam where it's not, where students are always given an array of different questions and they select from those questions which one they are going to answer. Where does it come from? Again, there's a model for that. I don't want to spend too much time on this model. I just wanted really to flash that model. It is a little bit overload. I just took this from the actual paper, and I believe it is a very good model, but it comes with a lot of text, and you need a lot of prior knowledge to actually appreciate this. But what I try to do is I try to break this down a little bit, and these are the bubbles that I created. So first of all, what you have is a threatening like you have a test situation, evaluative situation to begin with. But then what you have is those threatening cognition and images, those intrusions that you have, the worry that you have, the emotionality that comes up, okay? And what you try to do then is you try to cope with that. You try to find some strategies that help you overcome that. However, those strategies will depend very highly on your memory retrieval, on what worked in the past, what did not work in the past, what am I good at, what can I do in the situation. So all those coping strategies will ultimately depend on what you retrieve from memory. Now, if you already have high test anxiety, that memory retrieval of what the best coping strategy is will probably already be biased, right? And then on the long term, if this continues, that you only retrieve the negative experience that you have, you only employ dysfunctional strategies to cope with test anxiety, then again, the circle closes in a vicious way, increasing test anxiety in the future, okay? So I think what I want you to take out from this model is your coping strategies that students try to apply will depend on their what they can retrieve from their memory, what worked in the past. However, this will be biased if you are highly test anxious, because what you have stored there and what you can access will depend on those mal-adjusted coping strategies. And coming to the last question for today, yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say it's the last question, so that's all right, because I want to make sure that we have some time for, there are a lot of good questions coming, so just to make sure that we have time to answer them.
Yeah, it's the last one.
Cool.
And I think it will answer some of the questions as well, because someone already asked about what can we do about it.
Yeah, that's the most one, yeah.
Yeah, so what can we do about test anxiety here? Again, I was planning to do a little bit of a brainstorming activity here. So what do you think, what can be done about it? What would be potential intervention? We don't need to do that now. That's completely fine.
Yeah, they have been sharing some ideas as well.
That's fine. Yeah, that's good. Oh, man, amazing. That's good. I'm not skipping this bit. I'm not skipping. No, we're not skipping. I'm going through it. I'm going through this. Mentoring, yeah. So again, when we think about interventions, we want to think about, again, the different components that there are to test anxiety. And so research has, first of all, looked at different emotion-focused interventions. So here the aim is to reduce arousal, all those physiological responses that you have to test anxiety, this tension that you have, this stomach discomfort, and so on. And different interventions here, tackling the emotionality component, would be different relaxation and guided imagery. So thinking, imagining that as a positive thing to take the test and to perform and to write down and so on. Some conditioning, relearning of previously more detrimental, ways to approach that task, exactly. So with imagining positively on how to approach that task. And when we look at the research, just looking though at using those emotion-focused interventions, what we can see is on their own, just using those emotion-focused interventions, they don't seem to be that effective to reduce test anxiety, okay? And has been shown to show no effect on cognitive performance as well. So just using that kind of intervention will not get you as far. Then there are cognitive focus interventions. So here we want to reduce worry, those intrusive thoughts when students are taking the test or preparing for the test and so on. And again, this starts with understanding why test anxiety, why the student is experiencing test anxiety, and then start to find a way to think positively about test situations, try to focus the attention better when sitting an exam or when taking those questions. And those cognitive focus interventions have actually shown to be effective in reducing test anxiety. Very often you find combinations between this cognitive approach and the emotion approach. So sometimes it's like, okay, how will I focus on the actual target information, because that's basically the problem with test anxiety, and that's why it's often combined with emotion-focused aspects that relaxes the student first, prepares them to actually engage with the cognitive task. For the study skills intervention, this is the third category of interventions. And this is basically to improve how students take tests or study for tests. And again, this starts with time management before the test even occurs. So this is time management to actually schedule revision, to goal setting exercises, to create a study plan with students, to engage with them in effective strategies, such as, for example, quizzing. There is a study by Pooja Agarwal that showed large scale with many students that looked at classrooms that had a lot of retrieval practice, so quizzing in the classroom, and those with less. And they looked at test anxiety, and they found a correlation with more quizzing leading actually to lower, having a relationship with lower test anxiety experienced. And what can we see here for the effectiveness is that there's a positive impact of on the cognitive performance for students that have very high test anxiety and poor study skills. So giving those study skills has been shown to be very effective. However, the most effective combination is one that combines study skills interventions with the cognitive ones that I just mentioned before. So a combination of different approach within an intervention seems to be the way to go. Relaxation techniques, way to reinterpret the evaluative setting as non-threatening. Taking a lot of tests, giving tips on how to study, how to monitor time, how to schedule time, and how to answer the questions in regard to, okay, what to do, what if you can answer that one question, what should be your concrete next step afterwards. And largest positive effects have been shown to cope with test anxiety if you have a combination of different approaches. You can read this in your own time. It's just that if you have test anxiety, you are on a stimulation level that is too high. So what we want to have in students is something in the middle, so they have that enough energy to actually pay attention and to perform well. This is a resource that you can download of coping with exam pressure. This is from Dave Patway and his colleagues, and they put this together. It basically summarizes everything that I talked about today for students. So talking about, okay, that stress is not a bad thing. What are signs of exam anxiety? How to control physical reactions, so this is the emotionality part. How to be more confident about exams, so this is the cognitive part. And then how to best plan your revision. This is a study skills part. Thank you so much. I went way overboard. I'm so sorry about that. But I thought I wanted to give like a full picture, the fullest picture I can in that time about test anxiety. All resources that I have mentioned today, all links, the last resource, for example, as well, I have put them together in a document that you can access here under this link. And yeah, thank you so much.
No, thank you. We thank you. It's been really, really interesting. Too bad that we can't be here for 2 hours, but that's great. And I think that link for the resources that's here on the screen, that'll be very, very helpful. And we're going to share the slides, the links, and the recording of this talk with you, all of you, via email later on. And also, again, you can tweet us, Carolina, me, and Seneca, so we can carry on this conversation if we don't have time to answer your question. There are a few questions that just kept coming up over and over again. There was quite a few right in the beginning of your talk, when you were talking about differences between boys and girls and different ethnicities. There was also a question whether socioeconomic status has any effect on that, and the age of the students, so younger kids and secondary and then higher education.
Yeah, for the age, what I can say, what I recently read is that the proneness to react towards evaluative situations with test anxiety can start quite early when they're quite little in primary school or so. And then basically what happens, it builds up, if you can't find a coping mechanism due to this way it develops a vicious cycle, it builds up over time and can get more severe later on, simply because later on, if you go a secondary education and then later on for a higher education, it just, it gets more and more important to perform well. So the pressure is just more intense, and this can intensify test anxiety.
Yeah.
So yeah, and with socioeconomic status, it's always confounded with different things. So yeah, I don't know, have anything in particular right now in like, I don't have one study that I can just cite right now, but what I would say is that students from lower socioeconomic status may have less resources to actually study well, or study strategies that work with them. Maybe they have some caring, they have to care for other people, so they actually cannot schedule their studying freely as other students would do, and then yeah, this could contribute to higher test anxiety as well.
Yeah. There was an interesting question. Can you identify anxiety when you're marking exams, and then would you take that into account? So if you know some students have a problem with anxiety, would you mark them differently?
Well, the thing, it's very difficult to answer that one. From a higher education perspective, all marking is anonymous. So I don't really know whose work I'm marking. What is done usually in higher education, and that's the setting I can talk most about, is if you have people with high anxiety for evaluative situations, there are different things that are put in place beforehand so that they are actually to make up for it. For example, one thing that I said in one of my slides, sorry, I'll go back here for a second, for the moderators. Yeah, for the moderators, one aspect that leads to that negative relationship is, for example, speed at time conditions. And one thing that is done a lot is that students that have identified very high test anxiety and have that documented as such, they are given just more time during those situations just to make up for that.
Yeah. So there are people mentioning that now, and there was also a question before, even if you can't control, if you're taking GCSEs or A-levels, there's an examiner, an external examiner, and it's also anonymous. But what about the feedback that you give as a teacher or a lecturer during the school year?
Yeah.
Is there an effective way of giving this feedback so that you reduce students' anxiety for the actual exam?
Yeah. So again, I think that the key here is pretty much to show to the student and to adopt those individual norms. Again, I talked about this here, to make sure that, where is it? There. So talked a little bit about those two different reference norms. And when giving feedback, I think it's really important to adopt the individual reference norms. So to make sure the student understand, first of all, what they can do in the future to increase their performance. So to have very concrete steps here. Something that I do a lot. I don't give a lot of input and feedback here, but keep it very simple and concrete things that they can work on and tackle for the next time. So those are the 2 to 3 things that you can, I would like you to work on to improve your performance in the future. And this is something they can do right away. It's very concrete and very to the point. And showing them based on their own performance what they did. So this is what you did well, and this is basically what you can build on in the future, and not basically mentioning better than others, or this was not as good as other responses or something like that, because this again is adopting a group reference norm, and group reference norms are something that are very harmful for motivation and self-perception.
Yeah. You mentioned in one of the slides that sometimes students with high anxiety, they would procrastinate and then just leave studying and not do it until the end. Do you think that could happen with the other way around? So they get so anxious that they overstudy and they don't get any rest, or they don't sleep well, they don't eat well. Does that also happen?
So it could be could have manifest probably in different ways. So someone usually paired with perfectionism is something that's very dangerous. So if you have students that want to perform perfectly, so they have this on the higher performance level there. We have perfectionism that can be very, again, harmful for well-being and for and trigger anxiety as well. And so in here you can have someone who basically does not do anything but study, not taking any breaks, not sleeping well, or not, as you say, not eating well. Yeah. Then this again would be the how performance maybe can be harmed.
Yep. And lost mine. There were some questions about, not the focus of this presentation, but if you have something to say about the anxiety in teachers, when you have the anxiety when you are maybe even for young teachers who are just beginning now, to overcome them when they have to go in front of the class.
You tell me. I don't have any. I haven't looked into that, I have to say. It's a very interesting question, because I myself, as a student, actually experience high test anxiety. And when I started, and the thing is, back in when I was studying myself, there was no one that would there was nothing that you could do about it. Like, you know, university would be like it was back in Germany in the 2000s. We're like, oh, all right, yeah, you're a little nervous before an exam, so that's normal. And I'm like, that's no, it's more than that, right? And so my coping was just like, I have to go for it. I have to just do it. And I think when I started teaching, and again, this is just from a personal account now, I just thought, I think that's the only thing then. You just have to do it. But obviously, there are probably much better coping mechanisms for that, to actually decrease anxiety in teachers when they stand in front of a class. But unfortunately, I'm not the right person to answer this question. Right. You know.
Yeah, there are some other people commenting, I guess, more experienced teachers commenting on the chat as well. But that's also good, as in saying that just talk to the other teachers and don't be afraid to make mistakes. I think that's a good one.
I like this one here. So it's like to appear human, right? So very often there's like the thing where, oh, the teacher's like the person somewhere here, you know, knows everything, and just like but I think if you can appear human in front of students and actually say, okay, this is actually acquiring knowledge is a process and it's a journey, and I'm still on that journey. So it's just like, I may be on, know a little bit more than you right now, but I'm still learning. So it's not just basically everything is set in stone. So I think maybe that's one way.
I agree. I think that's a very good advice. There were some questions, obviously, also not the focus of this topic, but if you have something to say about that. Obviously, no exams this year.
Yeah.
And you told me before that you haven't specifically academically looked into that yet. But do you have any idea of what's going to happen with students next year when they have exams again? Or is there anything, I think maybe even more important, when we go back to school, are there any signs that teachers should be looking for to make sure students are doing okay and are coping with the anxiety?
I think what I can answer from this perspective is students in their final year this year didn't have their exams. And they're entering university next year. And obviously, this can be something that triggers a lot of anxiety in students. But what I can say from the perspective right now, again, looking at how University of Glasgow, because I'm in that bubble right now, and seeing what they are doing to accommodate level 1 students who are coming in, was exactly that experience. Is that we are going to do a lot to accommodate those students and to basically scaffold that process of sitting an exam. Simply because we know that this cohort that's coming in has been affected in that specific way. And so they will need a little bit more scaffolding in the beginning, guidance in the beginning towards self-regulated learning, towards test taking, and so on. And I think that is basically from the transition from school to university is always a challenging one. This year it will be even more challenging. And I hope that all universities, probably most of the universities will do that, have that in mind, acknowledge this, and put mechanisms in place to actually support the specific cohort who's coming in, who has not set an exam before.
Yeah. And there were, I think you talk about that being the end, but maybe we can leave that also for Twitter and emails, like actual concrete examples of cognitive focused interventions. If you can give maybe one example.
So if you go, that's why I put together this resource. But if you go on the resource, here, can you see this?
No.
No, you cannot. You cannot see it. Wait, let me just.
It's all right. You can just tell us, I guess.
Yeah, if you go on the resource that. definitely going
that you have on the last slide.
Yeah, exactly. Just let me go on the last slide here.
Yeah.
And I can just open it. So if you go on the last slide there, you see it will be just one page, but on the page I put a table in there from a study that came up with 6-step intervention strategies. It's called STEPS, Strategies to Tackle Exam Pressure and Stress. And it comes with 6 different sessions. And one of them tackles this cognitive approach or a cognitive aspect of tackling test anxiety. And it is based on cognitive behavioral therapy, where you replace negative thoughts with positive adaptive thoughts. So thinking about, for example, that this anxiety can be a good thing because it prepares you to actually tackle that exam. Showing them basically that if you have very low energy level, low anxiety or low energy level there, then you will be bored by it and will not perform as well. If you have too high, it will be too much to actually perform well. And something in the middle will have like the right energy level for you to actually sit the exam. And it has to do with different exercises that you do to actually realize that taking these exams is not a threat, but basically a way to show what you have done and understood before. And that, again, realizing that often it's just basically one, like if you have teachers doing multiple quizzes with you, it's just one thing that you do towards a larger goal. But even if you fail one thing, it is not basically the end of the world, and coming to a realization of those aspects of taking a test. Also giving them basically an example that I like very much is like actually student or people in general actually enjoy taking tests. So there's a reason why all those quiz shows are actually very popular, right? We like to take be challenged and trying to answer questions. For some reason then in the classroom environment, if it's too high stake, if it's too competitive, that they see that they are compared to other people, this can lead to this anxiety. But in itself, if they are, for example, sitting at home and taking a test or trying to answer questions, this is something that students report as not being in any kind harmful to them or difficult for them. So I think in the cognitive part is trying to make this link between that to take out the threat out of this. So, but again, if you look at the article that I shared, they give more examples on how to do that, because those are the people who actually came up with the intervention.
Yeah, and that sounds great. I think we ran out of time, but I just want to thank you once again for joining us. I'm sure I liked it, and I'm sure everybody did. There's been a lot of thank you and great. So thank you very much, Carolina, and thank you everybody who joined us.
Thank you.
We'll have another Teach Meet next Wednesday with Blake Harvard, who is a psychology teacher actually from the US. So he'll be joining us all the way from, I forgot his state, but somewhere in the USA. And he'll be talking about how to have an evidence-informed classroom. So using some of the things that Carolina mentioned, and talking about the curriculum and how to set up your class and how to talk to students, how to examine students, and etc. So, and you will get an email with all the resources, everything that Carolina mentioned by email, and also just tweet her and tweet us, and we'll send you some stuff also via Twitter as well.
I think Danny had a question here. Yeah, you can share it with your colleagues, no problem. The resources, yeah. They are all free to. So I try to put together resources in that document that everyone can just download and use right away. So yeah. Feel free to use it.
Fantastic. All right, everybody. So thank you. Stay safe, and I'll see you all next Wednesday.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.